Okay, so I'm taking on another project on my 2001 Ford Mustang Bullitt. The car has a problem right now. The horn works, but the cruise control won't work. Now, my original steering wheel had a problem with it along the top here. The leather was cracking and getting bad looking, so to fix that, I went ahead and pulled a new steering wheel with new buttons from the junkyard and installed it on the car. That didn't fix the problem, so that tells me more than likely the buttons are not the issue. There's another video on YouTube where an actual Ford technician discusses clock springs, which is the device back in the steering column behind the wheel here, which allows the steering wheel to turn in a column that's stationary and let the contacts flow through. We'll explain more on that later, but in one of his videos he explains that if you're having problems out of some functions in the steering wheel, more than likely the problem is the clock spring. And he said that's because the only actual power that comes into the steering column and the steering wheel is for the airbag. All other controls here, whether you have radio controls or just the horn and the cruise control like I do, it's all powered elsewhere in the car, and the circuit's just completed through here, but there's no actual 12-volt power. I don't quite understand exactly what he was saying, but that was what was indicated. That was the problem, was more than likely the clock spring. So I found a place that was selling OEM clock springs, new, not reman, not used, but actual Ford clock springs. So I spent a little bit extra to get an OEM part because I figured this is kind of important, being as the airbag and everything flows through it. So I'm going to do a little instructional thing on how to change your clock spring, because the ones that are out there right now can be a little bit, we'll just say hard to understand at times. So stay tuned. Alright, so getting started. First off, I just want to say please excuse the sound of my voice. I'm dealing with a little bit of a head cold while I'm doing this. So to start off with, anytime you're messing with an airbag in a car, always disconnect the battery first thing and be sure and let the battery sit disconnected. I'm going to let mine sit for 30 minutes. Some people say 15, 20 minutes, whatever it takes to let the capacitors drain off their power so you don't have an accidental discharge of the airbag. I'm going to wait 30 just in case. But when that 30 minutes has expired, first thing I'll do is pop loose this little cap. There's one on both sides, and inside here I believe it's an 8mm bolt. And so once these caps are off, you just put a socket on there, twist that 8mm bolt out on both sides. There too. And the airbag should just lift right off of there, and you'll be down to the steering wheel. So that's where we'll pick up in about 30 minutes. Okay, I forgot to mention a couple more little tidbits. So your lower fascia, the lower dash cover here, is held on, the plastic piece held on by two 8mm bolts. One will be on this side, one will be on the opposite side. Once you take those two bolts loose, it's basically just some clips. You just got to give it a little firm tug to pull it down and out away from the dash. See, they just kind of plug into here. Now be careful, because our car's getting a little bit older, and as we all know, this plastic stuff kind of dry rots and deteriorates, and before you know it, it'll break real easy. So be very careful, because that can be brittle and you don't want to have to go hunting a new part. And once you get that off, there's actually a steel plate that goes across this also, with two more 8mm bolts, one here and one on the other side right there. Once that plate's down, that gives you access to the connections where that clock spring is going to be hooking up at. So the next thing we're going to do, in the meantime, we're still waiting on that capacitors to drain off from disconnecting the battery. There's a couple screws underneath the column here that'll let this lower column surround come off and give us access to the rest of the cabling. So, okay, so we've let enough time go by for our capacitors to discharge. I've removed the bolts from either side of the airbag and the steering wheel, and basically it just lifts out, and you'll find a wire here on the back. It plugs into the airbag. So there's a tab on the bottom side of this. Underneath right here, you have to depress the tab and unplug, release. You see a little tab you gotta depress. You gotta do that so it unlocks the locking mechanism into the airbag. So we can set it aside. Now, you've got several wires in here. You see, this is the back side of the clock, so the front side of the clock spring has assist through the steering wheel. So these are connections coming through the clock spring. So we'll see this one here needs to be disconnected as well. It's just got a little base where it mounts there. I'll pull it loose. And out here where I can get to it pretty good. You'll notice another little locking mechanism right here. You need to lift up on that one to release it. And then unplug. All right, so with that being said, we now need to take this Torx bolt out that holds the steering wheel in place. And that one's a little bit loose. That's a T45. I'm gonna have to find the proper one. I think it's a T50. All right, so yeah, I was correct. That is a T50 Torx bit. Let's take that bolt loose from the steering column. Here's maybe a little bit tighter than that. I've already had this steering wheel off several times. So I'm going to turn this bolt all the way out and lift it out completely. So I know it's not engaging any threads. I'm going to thread it back in just a couple turns. That way I know when I get the steering wheel off, popped loose the way I'm going to do it, that's not going to come flying off and bust me in the mouth. The proper way is to use a steering wheel puller threaded with 2 threaded bolts that thread into either one of these holes and a bolt in the middle of the saddle that tightens up here, applying pressure to this centerpiece while pulling out on the steering wheel to dislodge it. I'm going to show you another little trick. Okay, so the other little trick to getting your steering wheel off without having a steering wheel puller, get yourself in a comfortable seated position, get your knees below the steering wheel and against it. I also use the tilt feature to get the steering wheel down as low as possible. So with my knees, I'm going to apply force backwards on the bottom of the steering wheel, and with my hands I'm going to do it up top here, and I'm going to slowly rock it back and forth and up and down to get it popped loose. This isn't an exact science, so bear with me. And there it went. You'll feel it when it disengages, and that's why it's very important to put this bolt back in the middle, because if I had not put that bolt back in the middle, this would have come flying off and probably hit me in the face. And now this is where we're at with an exposed clock ring. This is the assembly we're going to be changing out. I'm going to have to do a little more investigating because evidently the cabling goes underneath. See this yellow cable comes from the clock spring. I may have to loosen this Torx bolt and take this little module off and out of the way to get it out, the cable out from behind that module. Okay, so the job got a little more involved as I went. I discovered I needed to take the outer bezel off my gauge cluster to get this upper part of the column cowling removed. I also had to take out the ignition switch, the key mechanism. Now, in order to do that, you basically put your key in, cycle it forward to the run position, and then you'll notice on the bottom here, a little hole right there, there'll be a tab, a little piece. You just stick a small poker in there and push in while the key's in the run position, and it pulls right out. So, lock cylinder pulled out, gauge bezel removed. At that point, with the column tilted down, I was able to remove the upper part of the cowling. You have to have this key out to get this upper part of the cowling out, because it's like the outside diameter of the key switch is larger than the hole in the cowling. So Reason I had to do all that is, number one, I didn't want to damage this piece that has something to do with the ignition system. So I removed the small Torx bit that holds it in place, and it basically just pulls off this outer portion like that and get set it down out of the way. Now the second part of the reason why I had to do all that is because this is actually a part of the clock spring wiring. The new clock spring has this piece, so it will have to be removed also. I haven't gone so far as to look in to see, okay, we got a little electrical contact in here. So it looks like this just basically pulls out. Yeah, it did. Okay, so my next step will be just to unplug the yellow cable from these two sockets up here where it's plugged into, and I'll be ready to release the two tabs that actually hold the clock spring on. There's a tab here at the top. It'll pull this way, and there's a tab right here at the bottom. It just pulls down, outward. And you can see on my new clock spring, let me get the right orientation here, what I'm talking about. So this is the one at the top, pulls to the right. The one at the bottom down here just pulls straight down. So I'm gonna get my wires unplugged from underneath and get this popped off, and we'll start again. Okay, another quick note, you saw earlier these two plugs were keyed into these holes in this metal right here. The little mounts had them plugged in and held nice and neat up out of the way. I found it easier to just go ahead and pull those loose from that mount and get them down. That way you can tell exactly how they unplug. I'm trying to be really careful with everything I do to not damage the old clock spring, just for the fact that sometimes I don't always get things just right, and maybe I don't have the exact right clock spring and there's some other issue, and I got to put my car back together for the meantime until I get the proper one. So I'm always kind of careful about that. Now the new clock spring comes with new mounts to push right in there, so everything should be cool. Should plug right back in where it's supposed to be nice and neat up out of the way, just like the original. But just in case, I'm being careful. All right, so I realized there was more than just the two tabs, the one at the top and the one at the bottom. There was a third one over here on the side. So just be careful and make sure and disengage all three tabs, the top, the bottom, and the one right at the key switch before you go and try to pull off and remove your old clock spring. So at this point, it's basically going to be just to install the new one, same way the old one came off. When I get this all done and get a little testing done, I'm going to open up the old clock spring so we can get a look inside after I know my new one works and everything's good. So something else to note on the clock springs, a new clock spring will come with this little pull tab on this one side. That is to keep the clock spring from unwinding, if you will. So the way this thing's designed, you've got basically a wire that's made like a ribbon, and it's round, wrapped around inside here. So when you turn your wheel one direction, it's unwinding. All right, it leaves you connection throughout the hole, and you straighten your wheel back up. When you turn the other way, it's got enough loose wire inside here that's actually winding up. So you understand by that method, you've got a happy medium, a middle point between unwinding and winding. So that's what the pull tab's for. That's to keep this thing during shipping to slowly rattle its way around and get to an off position, because if you get it to where it's wound up too tight and you install it and you go to turn the wheel that direction, it'll just break the cable and it'll be junk again. So be sure and get your orientation proper. Make sure your tabs are going to line up. Yep, I dropped it. So anyhow, make sure the tabs are going to line up. You get your orientation right. Get it snapped in. Plug everything up. Okay, so my new clock spring snapped on just right. Nice. Pop right in place. The little black wire, I slid right onto the ignition housing. Slid right into place just like the old one did. Snapped right in. this outer ring thing, whatever this is. I think it's part of the transponder system for the transponder key. It slid right back on the outside after I put my yellow cable behind. There's a little mount behind here that kind of holds the yellow cable in place. I'll put the yellow cable there and put it in this mount also. I like everything being right where it's supposed to be from the factory. And put my screw back in to hold this all. So, plug my wires back up. Hung them back in the stock location where they're supposed to be with the new tabs. Everything's going quick, smooth, and easy right now. At this point, I'm ready to pull this tab and put my steering wheel on, because now this tab can safely come out now because the clock spring is snapped into the column and it is keyed onto the shaft, so it can't get out of sequence or sync like we talked about earlier. So, also, that's neat, it says top right there to let you know when you're putting the clock spring on, that's the top. So, I'm gonna pull the tab, feed the wires through my steering wheel, and put my steering wheel all on here and back together. Actually, I think before I do that, I'm gonna put the rest of the column together so I don't have to fight around the steering wheel. So we'll pick up where we left off in a minute. Okay, here we are with a couple more notes. Number one thing to keep in mind, if you're doing this yourself, this is your car. Be careful, take your time. If you get frustrated with something, stop what you're doing. Go get a drink of water, sit in the house in the air conditioning, cool down, whatever it takes to get your head straight, because if you don't take your time with this and get things lined up just right, you're going to end up breaking parts, messing stuff up, and being ticked off later on. Couple of things to note when you're putting this upper cowling back on. When I was taking it out of here, of course, all this stuff was out of the way like you saw. I still had to kind of bend it, mangle it, not mangle, but bend it out of its position that it's comfortable with to get it out of here. Going back in was the same way. You have a couple things to contend with. You got the ignition switch release lever here. You've got the emergency flasher lever here. So there's a couple things to contend with, plus the threaded portion in this upper piece that the screw from the bottom threads into actually keys into a loop in the column. So you're gonna make sure when you get this thing back in place, kind of make sure it sits there nice and easy. You're not fighting to get it to hold in spot. And then when you put the bottom one on, there's a couple clips here and in the back here and on this side that line everything up. Make sure that stuff's all lined up nice where it just snaps right together easily. That way you're not gonna have an issue to fight with later. And then you've got the screws to put back in, one on this side and 3 on this other side. One at the bottom, one at the top, one in the middle. Now, when I took my ignition switch, the key switch part out, I know the way this stuff works, just like with this clock spring, stuff has an orientation when it twists and turns. So when I took that thing out, it went straight over here and sat right there. I didn't want to have no chances on bumping it or something else and get it twisted to where it's out of position it wants to be in. So this should basically fall right back in. Just like this. Just like that. Now, if you ever did have to remove your ignition switch and didn't want to take all the cowling off, let's say you had a problem with your switch, there's a hole in this cowling on the bottom. That one's for a screw. You notice this hole as well. That's the one you'll reach through with your poker when it's in the start, or the run position to remove the key switch. So, I did pretty good, I think. Everything's falling right back in place like it wants to be. So, next step, pull the tab, put my wheel on. All right, so I fed the 2 wires back through the big hole in the wheel. Now, you'll notice the wheel, the way it's clocked, it's got like a square shaft. So, don't worry about getting it a notch off or something like old steering wheels where you'll be driving on the road and it'll be slightly cocked and you're going straight. Shouldn't have that problem if you already had a good alignment. Put it back on, tighten the bolt back up. I'm sure there's a torque spec for that. I don't know what it is. I just tightened it up to where I thought, hey, it's good. I plugged in this plug back in place, and like I said before, I like everything being in the right spot. So there's actually a little tab right here cast into the plastic of this, and that's a little spring clip just slides right on top of to hold it in place. So I'm ready to plug in my airbag, put it back in, put the 2.8mm bolts back in, and put the little reveal caps on. Okay, so follow up. I know this is my old clock spring. I know I mentioned in the video where we're swapping this thing out that I would take it apart and show you guys the inner workings when we all got done, and I knew the new one was working, or at least I knew it was going to be functional. We'd take this one apart. You notice there's some little tabs around the inside of this part right here where it splines on the steering wheel. You see there's a couple little tabs left there. I've cut some of them off with my pocket knife so that it'll come apart, but that's what actually locks it all together. And you see what I'm talking about with these ribbons. The ribbon's basically wound around and makes contact as that thing goes around one way and the other. It releases and tightens up and so on, and that's what gives you your functions through the wheel. The contacts come in and connect to the wiring on this side, and on the other side they terminate the same way and come out the wiring on that side. So that's the inside of your clock spring. This one actually looks really good, surprisingly. Typically the problems you'll find with clock springs are right here at the end. Right there at the end where they terminate, they'll have like a hard bend or something to them. This one actually looked like it was in really good shape. This was probably a still good and functioning clock spring before I swapped it out, especially since now that we've gone on the test drive, we realized that replacing the clock spring did not fix my cruise control. So just wanted to follow up, and because I told you guys I'd take that apart. Thanks.